In the Old West, the truth isn't always what it seems. Every story here is born of dust, loss, and revenge. I and voices of the Old West, and this is another scar etched in the earth.
Ruby McAllister's world had always been the wilderness. Raised in a small weathered cabin deep within the forest of the American West, she had grown accustomed to a life of solitude. Her father, a strict and distant man, had taught her how to survive, how to live off the land, how to defend herself, and how to be strong. There was no room for softness, no place for vulnerability in the wild. Ruby had learned to live by her instincts, and those instincts had kept her alive. Her father's lessons had shaped her into a woman who was feared by the few who lived nearby. She was strong, independent, and untamed, a creature of the wilderness. The people in the nearby town spoke of her in hushed tones. Some respected her, others feared her. Ruby didn't care for either. One day, as she ventured to the edge of the forest for a rare trip into town, she felt an unfamiliar pull in the air. It wasn't just the thought of the people there, or the noise of the saloons. It was something else. She didn't know it then, but this trip would change everything. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon as Ruby stepped into the dusty streets of the town. The small frontier settlement was like so many others, a collection of rough, weathered buildings, the scent of gunpowder hanging in the air. It wasn't a place for people like Ruby, but today she felt a strange need to be there. As she entered the saloon, the dimly lit room fell quiet for a moment. Ruby's eyes scanned the space. Rowdy men, cards being shuffled, the clink of glasses filled with whiskey. But it was the man at the far end of the bar that caught her attention. He wasn't like the others. Jack Dalton. The moment their eyes met, Ruby knew that this wasn't just another man. There was something about him, something that stirred something deep inside her. His eyes were cold, calculating, filled with a heaviness she couldn't understand. There was a darkness there, a burden he carried, and yet there was an undeniable connection. For the first time in years, Ruby felt something stir inside her, a vulnerability she had long ago buried. The saloon was a place of noise, smoke, and disorder, but in the corner where Ruby stood, everything seemed to quiet down. The sight of Jack Dalton had an almost magnetic pull on her, and despite herself, she found herself drawn toward him. His presence was like a storm on the horizon, calm, but with a promise of something more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Ruby wasn't one to be drawn to men, especially not the kind she could tell Jack was, but there was something different about him, something that made her heart race. The moment Jack looked up, locking eyes with Ruby, a silent understanding passed between them. It wasn't love nor desire, not yet, but it was something raw, something unspoken that tied them together in a way Ruby couldn't explain. She quickly looked away, almost embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. She didn't need anyone, especially not someone like him. But fate wasn't finished with Ruby yet. A group of rowdy men entered the saloon, their laughter and boisterous voices shattering the fragile calm of the room. Ruby's instincts immediately kicked in. She watched them with the sharp eye of someone who had learned to trust no one. These men were trouble, drunk, loud, and full of bravado, but they weren't just any troublemakers. They had a certain air about them, a dangerous swagger like they thought they owned the town. And it was clear they were looking for trouble. One of the men, a hulking figure with a thick neck and a deep scowl, locked eyes with Jack, his grin spreading slowly. Ruby felt her stomach tighten, knowing exactly what was coming. The saloon quieted as the man sauntered over to Jack, who hadn't moved an inch since Ruby had first noticed him. The air in the room thickened with anticipation. "Well, well," the man sneered. "I was wondering when we'd run into you, Dalton. Ain't no surprise you're holed up here, just like always." Jack didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. It was always enough. But the man, clearly hoping to provoke a response, leaned closer, his voice dripping with malice. "You think you can just waltz into town and not face the consequences?" The man growled, the room hanging on his every word. Ruby's eyes narrowed, watching Jack carefully. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he slowly shifted his weight. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he was more than ready for one. Ruby knew that about him. She could see the quiet strength that lay beneath his calm exterior. Without warning, the man's hand shot toward the holster on his hip. The sound of the gun being drawn was like a crack of thunder, and Ruby's heart skipped a beat. Jack moved faster than the eye could follow. In an instant, his hand was around the man's wrist, stopping the gun from drawing any further. The other men froze, surprised by Jack's speed. Ruby saw the flash of steel in his hand before it was too late. The gunman's weapon hit the ground with a dull thud, his hand now twisted painfully by Jack's iron grip. The room fell silent, everyone waiting for Jack's next move. The man groaned in pain, but didn't dare make another move. Jack's eyes never left him, and the intensity in the room was almost suffocating. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. Ruby's breath was shallow. She didn't know why, but the scene unfolding before her stirred something deep inside. She had seen violence before, even caused it herself, but there was something different in the way Jack handled things. It was calm, controlled, as if he knew exactly how to handle this world, a world Ruby knew all too well. The man's face twisted in frustration, but he didn't try to fight back. "You think you're the only one who can draw a gun, Dalton?" he spat, his voice barely above a whisper now. Jack's grip tightened for a second, and then, with a final twist, he released the man's wrist, sending him stumbling back. "Next time," Jack said in a low, gravelly voice, "you won't be so lucky." The man didn't respond. He just backed away, eyes on Jack, knowing there was no use in pushing further. The other men, realizing their leader had been bested, followed suit and slunk away. Ruby stood frozen, her heart racing. The adrenaline of the moment slowly began to fade, but the tension in her chest remained. Jack Dalton hadn't said much, but his actions had spoken volumes. Jack turned his back to her, returning to his quiet spot at the bar. Ruby stood there for a moment longer, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man, and why did she feel like she had just crossed paths with someone who could change her life forever? Ruby had never been one to linger in places where she didn't belong, but there was something about Jack Dalton that made her hesitate. As the saloon began to buzz with life again, Ruby remained rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on him. He hadn't said a word to her, hadn't even acknowledged her presence since the confrontation, but there was a quiet pull, a magnetic force that kept her from turning and walking away. She wasn't used to feeling drawn to anyone, especially not a man like him. She had no interest in his type, pistoliers, men with pasts as dark as the night they lived in, but there was something different about Jack, something raw and broken, and yet powerful. She didn't know how long she stood there, lost in thought, until the bartender, a stout man with a thick mustache, cleared his throat. "You gonna sit down, miss, or just stand there all night?" he asked with a grunt. Ruby snapped out of her trance and nodded, moving to a seat near the bar, but not too close to Jack. She wasn't ready for that yet. Her eyes briefly met his, but he didn't react. She ordered a drink, whiskey, neat, and sat with her back to the rest of the room, her mind racing with questions. What was it about Jack Dalton that kept pulling her in? She had always been self-sufficient, independent, a woman who didn't need anyone. But the more she thought about him, the more she realized that she had never encountered a man like him before. Not in the wilds of the forest, not in the isolated corners of the world she called home. It was then that Ruby heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. She turned her head slightly, and there he was, Jack Dalton, standing right beside her. His eyes met hers, and there was something in his gaze that made her heart skip a beat. He didn't smile, didn't speak at first. He just stood there like a man who had lived his whole life waiting for something or someone he couldn't quite reach. After a long moment he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You don't belong here." Ruby stiffened, surprised by the words. "Neither do you," she shot back without missing a beat. Jack didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, like a man who had seen too much to be rattled by anything. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I don't have a choice." Ruby looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "What does that mean?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a seat next to her, his presence filling the space between them. He wasn't looking for conversation, not really, but Ruby's silence seemed to pull something from him, something deeper than the tough exterior he showed the world. "Where are you from?" Ruby asked, not sure why she was even asking. "The same place you are," he replied simply, his eyes flickering to the door as if something outside were calling to him. Ruby didn't respond at first. She wasn't sure how to react. What was it about Jack that made her want to know more, even when she knew she shouldn't? She'd never been interested in any man's past, but something about him felt different. She could see the weight he carried, the burden he tried so hard to hide. Before Ruby could say anything else, the door swung open with a loud crash. The familiar group of men who had caused trouble earlier stormed back in, their anger palpable. The leader, the one Jack had put in his place, glared at them, his eyes burning with fury. They weren't done, not by a long shot, by a long. Ruby's pulse quickened, and she instinctively reached for her sidearm, the cool metal reassuring in her grip. Jack didn't even look at her. Instead, he stood, his expression unreadable. "You need to leave," Ruby said quietly, not wanting to cause trouble, but knowing this was about to turn ugly. Jack turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers for a brief moment. "I'm not the one they're after," he said, his voice low, "but you might be." Ruby's heart raced as the group of men closed in. She knew exactly what Jack meant. They weren't here for him. They were here for her. The room was thick with tension as the group of men circled around Ruby and Jack. Ruby could feel her heart pounding in her chest, every instinct in her body screaming that this wasn't going to end well. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for things to calm down. The storm was already here. Jack's hand moved to his belt, where his revolver rested. It wasn't the first time Ruby had been in a standoff, but something about this felt different. She wasn't just facing a bunch of drunk troublemakers. These men had a purpose. They weren't just looking to fight. They were looking to send a message. You think you can just walk in here, ruin our fun, and leave? The leader, the one Jack had disarmed earlier, spat on the ground. His face was twisted in rage. He was still nursing his pride, still furious that Jack had embarrassed him so easily. Ruby knew she had to act fast. If they weren't careful, this would escalate in a way they couldn't control. "Leave," Ruby said, her voice steady. She wasn't afraid. She never had been. But she knew this wasn't a fight she could win alone. One of the men laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You think you can order us around, girl?" He took a step closer, his hand hovering near the gun at his side. Ruby's hand twitched toward her own revolver, but Jack was faster. Before Ruby could even draw, he was already in motion, moving with the deadly precision of a man who had fought more battles than he cared to count. In one fluid movement, Jack had his gun in hand, the barrel aimed directly at the man's chest. "You've got two choices," Jack said in a voice so calm it sent a chill down Ruby's spine. "You can walk out of here alive, or you can try me again. Your choice." The room was completely still. The clinking of glasses, the murmurs of the other patrons, everything fell away. All eyes were on Jack. Ruby could see the hesitation in the man's eyes. The leader had been strong when he had a gang to back him up. But now, standing face to face with a man like Jack Dalton, all his bravado melted away. He was no longer the dominant force in the room. "Don't make me do this," Jack added, his voice a whisper, but it carried a weight that spoke volumes. The man's eyes darted between Jack and his friends. For a long moment, it seemed like he might try something foolish, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He slowly holstered his gun, signaling to the others to do the same. They didn't speak, didn't make a move, but they backed away. Their pride had been bruised, but their lives were more valuable. Without a word, the group turned and exited the saloon, their footsteps heavy and defeated. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, and the murmur of conversation returned. Ruby stayed still, her hand still on her sidearm, but her eyes never left Jack. There was something about him that unsettled her, something raw and dangerous, but there was also a part of her that couldn't deny the pull he had on her. Jack didn't speak for a moment. He holstered his gun with a smooth, practiced motion, his eyes never leaving the door the men had just exited. It was only when the room had fully returned to normal that he turned to Ruby. "You're lucky I was here," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much. Ruby nodded slowly, but the words she wanted to say, "thank you," or maybe something else, stuck in her throat. She didn't need saving. She never had. But something about the way Jack had handled the situation, the calmness with which he had neutralized the threat, made her feel a strange mixture of gratitude and discomfort. "I don't need your help," Ruby finally said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions in her chest. "But thanks, I guess." Jack's lips quirked in a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Doesn't matter if you need it or not. Sometimes people just end up in the right place at the right time." Ruby took a deep breath, still processing what had just happened. The fight had been avoided, but the underlying tension between them was only growing. She wasn't sure what it was about Jack Dalton, but she knew she was being pulled into something she wasn't prepared for. And as the night wore on, Ruby realized that the more she tried to pull away, the closer she was drawn to him. There was no escaping it. Fate had already decided their paths were going to cross. The quiet returned to the saloon, returned to the... But Ruby couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the air. The confrontation had ended, but the weight of Jack Dalton's presence remained. She couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them, even though they hadn't exchanged more than a few words. Ruby looked down at her hands, which still trembled slightly from the tension of the standoff. It wasn't the first time she had been in a dangerous situation, but it was the first time she'd ever felt vulnerable in front of another person. It made her uncomfortable, more than she cared to admit. The bartender slid a fresh glass of whiskey in front of her, and Ruby nodded her thanks. She wasn't ready to leave yet. There was too much on her mind, too many questions she needed answered, and not just about Jack. Ruby knew about his reputation. There were whispers in every corner of the West about Jack Dalton, the silent, cold gunslinger who carried a past heavier than most men could bear. She'd heard the stories, the rumors, but they never seemed real until now. Now she had seen him in action, and those rumors were no longer just stories. He was real, and the gravity of his presence weighed on everything around him. Jack took a seat across the room, his back to her, his posture rigid. He had a way of standing apart from everything, always observing, always detached, and yet Ruby could feel the storm inside him. There was something there, something dark and unresolved. She found herself drawn to him again, despite the wariness that clouded her thoughts. It was dangerous, she knew that, but she couldn't help it. There was a pull she couldn't explain. Ruby finished her drink and stood, deciding it was time to leave before she made any more impulsive decisions. But as she turned toward the door, she felt a presence behind her. Jack's voice, quiet but commanding, stopped her in her tracks. "You should stay," Jack said, his tone neutral, almost distant. Ruby didn't turn to face him immediately. She wasn't sure how to respond. She wasn't used to being told what to do, and yet there was something about the way he said it that made her hesitate. "I'm not here for company," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. She didn't want to be anyone's project, especially not Jack Dalton's. There was a pause before Jack spoke again. His voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself more than to her. "No one ever is." Ruby finally turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat at the vulnerability she saw in his eyes for just a brief moment. It was the first crack in the armor he had built around himself, and Ruby couldn't look away. "I don't need saving, Jack," she said, her voice softer now, a hint of something she couldn't quite identify creeping into her words. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand something about her. Then he nodded slowly. "I never said you did," he said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. Ruby felt a pang of frustration. Why was this so complicated? Why couldn't she just walk away and forget about him, the way she had done with every other man who tried to get close? But Jack wasn't like the others. He was too much like her in ways she didn't want to admit. Before she could respond, the door to the saloon swung open again, and a man stepped inside, a tall figure with a wide-brimmed hat, his face obscured by the shadow it cast. Ruby didn't have to see his face to know that trouble had followed him. Jack's expression darkened instantly, and Ruby's instincts screamed at her. This was no coincidence. The man's eyes scanned the room, but when they landed on Jack, there was no mistaking the recognition in his gaze. Ruby felt the air grow heavy again, tension building in the room once more. The man's hand hovered near his gun as he made his way to the bar, his gaze never leaving Jack. Ruby's pulse quickened. She could feel the danger in the air before anyone spoke. "You're still here, Dalton," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. Jack didn't respond at first, but the look he gave the man was enough to convey everything Ruby needed to know. This wasn't just any stranger. This was someone from Jack's past, someone who had come to settle an old score. Ruby's heart raced as the man continued to approach, and she instinctively placed her hand on the grip of her own revolver. She had no idea what this man wanted, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. Jack stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the man, and for the first time, Ruby saw the flicker of something in his gaze. Anger, yes, but also a deep sense of regret, a past he couldn't escape. And as the man finally spoke again, Ruby knew that their encounter was far from over. "You don't get to walk away from this, Dalton," the man snarled. "Not after what you did." The air in the saloon thickened as the man's words hung heavily between them. Ruby could feel the tension in her bones. She had lived long enough to know when trouble was coming, and this was trouble she couldn't ignore. The stranger's voice was gravelly, rough, as if he had been using it to spit out venom for years. There was no question now. Jack Dalton wasn't just a man with a dark past, he was a man running from it. And that past had followed him right into the saloon. Jack didn't react immediately, his hand still resting near the handle of his revolver. His face remained calm, but Ruby could see the small, almost imperceptible twitch in his jaw, a sign that the past was threatening to resurface. "Leave," Jack said quietly, his voice steady, but with an underlying tension that wasn't lost on Ruby. It was clear this wasn't just about a fight, this was personal. The man laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You think you can just tell me to leave, Dalton? Not after everything you've done." Ruby's eyes flicked between the two men. She had no idea what history they shared, but she could sense the weight of it in the air. This wasn't some petty grudge. This was something much deeper, something that had festered over time and now came to a head. Jack took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving the man. "I'm done with this," he said, his voice cold as ice. "You want revenge? You're too late. I'm not the man I was." The man sneered, his hand twitching near his gun. "You don't get to decide when it ends. You owe me, Dalton. You always will." Ruby could feel the unease growing inside her. The man wasn't just angry, he was desperate. and desperation made people dangerous. She slowly stood, her hand still resting on her own weapon just in case. Jack's stance didn't change. He was still calm, but there was something darker brewing beneath the surface. Ruby could see it in his eyes. It was the same look he had given the men earlier, quiet, controlled, but ready to unleash if necessary. The stranger took a step closer, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. "You think I forgot? You think I'm just going to let you walk away after everything?" His voice was rising now, each word laced with fury. "I've been hunting you for years. Dalton, and this time there won't be a way out." Ruby's instinct screamed at her. This man wasn't just looking for a fight. He was looking for blood. She had to act fast, but she also knew Jack was the only one who could handle this. He wasn't a man who needed saving, but something told her that whatever happened next, she wouldn't be able to walk away from it. Jack finally spoke, his words slow but deliberate. "You've been hunting me? I haven't been running from you. I've been running from myself." His voice grew harder, colder. "You came all this way for revenge, but it won't change anything. You're still going to be the same man you were when you walked in here, empty, forlorn, chasing ghosts." The room fell silent. The stranger's face twisted with rage, but for a brief moment, Ruby thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Jack had hit a nerve, but before Ruby could process it, the stranger's hand shot out, pulling his gun in one fluid motion. Ruby's heart stopped. In an instant, Jack moved. The speed at which he drew his own weapon was almost blinding, and Ruby didn't even hear the gunshot. It was like time slowed, everything around her blurring in the wake of Jack's lightning-fast response. The sound of the shot rang out a second later, and the man stumbled back, his gun falling to the ground with a thud. The man didn't fall, he didn't have the chance. Jack had shot his hand clean, a precise strike that made it impossible for him to hold the weapon. Ruby stood frozen, her eyes wide, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The saloon was eerily quiet. The only sound, the man's gasping breaths as he stared at the stump of his hand. Jack's gun was already holstered, his gaze locked on the man as he collapsed to his knees. "I told you," Jack said quietly. "It's over." The man looked up at Jack, his face pale, and for a moment, Ruby saw something different in him. Fear and something more, regret. But it was too late. Ruby's hands were trembling, and her mind raced. She had seen violence before, she had been a part of it, even caused it, but this was different. This was personal. This was Jack's world, a world filled with danger and people like the man on the floor, people who didn't know when to let go of the past. Jack's voice cut through the silence again. "Get out of here before I change my mind." The man scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of pain and fury, but there was nothing left in him. No fight, no pride, only the remnants of a grudge that had cost him everything. With one last glare at Jack, the man staggered out of the saloon, leaving the door swinging behind him. Ruby didn't know what to say. Her heart was still racing, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders, and for the first time, she understood the kind of life Jack Dalton led. It wasn't just the fights or the guns, it was the ghosts, the ones he couldn't escape, no matter how far he ran. Jack turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You should go," he said, his voice low. Ruby didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what he meant, and yet she couldn't move. Ruby stood in the saloon, her body frozen as Jack's words hung in the air. "You should go." The command wasn't harsh, but it was final, and Ruby knew it. There was a part of her that understood it, the part that had always been self-sufficient, never needing anyone. But another part of her, one she couldn't ignore, felt something deeper, a connection, however twisted, that was pulling her back toward him. Jack's gaze softened just slightly, though his face remained hard and unreadable. He wasn't asking her to leave out of malice, but because he knew that the longer she stayed in his world, the more danger she'd find herself in. Ruby didn't want to leave. She had faced danger before, and she knew how to handle herself. But this wasn't just about her anymore. She could feel the weight of Jack's past pressing on her, the tension in his every move, the battle between what he had been and what he might still become. The ghosts of his past were chasing him, and they were starting to chase her too. "You think I don't know how to take care of myself?" Ruby asked, her voice quiet but firm. She wasn't sure if she was talking to Jack or to herself, maybe both. Jack didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't say you couldn't. I'm saying you don't need to be part of this." Ruby felt a pang in her chest. It wasn't pity. She wasn't the type to be pitied. But something in Jack's words made her wonder if he thought she was too weak to handle his life. It wasn't about weakness. She knew that much. Before Ruby could respond, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway, casting a long shadow across the room. It was the bartender, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He didn't have to say anything. Ruby could see it in his face. "There's more of them," the bartender whispered, voice shaking. "Outside, looking for you, Dalton." Ruby's blood ran cold. The past wasn't finished with Jack, and now it was coming for both of them. Jack's face hardened at the news. He didn't hesitate. His hand moved instinctively to his revolver again. "Get to the back," he ordered Ruby, his voice low but commanding. Ruby felt a surge of resistance. "I'm not running." Jack didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the door. "You don't have a choice." Before Ruby could protest further, Jack was already moving, his steps quick and sure. She followed reluctantly, but there was something inside her that told her she had to stay close. She wasn't going to run. Not from this, not from him. They made their way through the narrow hall that led to the back of the saloon, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them. Ruby's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear voices now, muffled but unmistakable. The men Jack had crossed earlier, the ones who had come looking for trouble, were still out there, and they were getting closer. "We don't have much time," Jack muttered as he reached the back door. He pushed it open just enough to peek out. Ruby joined him, her breath shallow as she squinted into the dark alleyway behind the saloon. The shadows were moving. There were more of them, at least 4, maybe more. Ruby could see the glint of metal in the moonlight, the unmistakable shape of guns ready to be drawn. "We need a plan," Ruby said, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. She wasn't afraid of a fight. She had faced enough to know what to expect. But these weren't just random men. They were after Jack, and by extension, they were after her. Jack's eyes flicked to her for a brief moment. "There's only one plan," he said, his voice cold. "Survive." Ruby didn't argue. She could see the resolve in his eyes. He wasn't looking to make friends, and he wasn't planning to run. Jack was ready to fight, and so was she. They both knew what was at stake. Ruby stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. "Then let's do it." Before Jack could respond, a shout rang out from the alley. A man appeared, his figure silhouetted by the dim light. "Dalton!" he yelled, his voice thick with rage. "We've got unfinished business." Ruby's hand was already on her gun. Jack's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something else in them, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. The man took a step closer, and Ruby could hear the others behind him, creeping forward like wolves circling their prey. But Ruby didn't flinch. She wasn't about to let them have the upper hand. Jack raised his gun first, aiming it at the man who had spoken. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Ruby knew what was coming, but she was ready. The night outside the saloon had fallen into a thick, oppressive silence. The alley was shadowed, the only sounds the distant hum of the wind and the crunch of boots on gravel. Ruby stood beside Jack, both of them waiting for the inevitable, knowing the moment had come. There was no turning back. The man in the alley, the one who had called out to Jack, took another step forward. His silhouette was clear now in the moonlight, and Ruby could see the cruel sneer on his face. He wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, circling them like vultures. At least 4 men, maybe more, each one armed and ready for a fight. "You think you can just walk away, Dalton?" The man sneered, his voice low and venomous. He was taller than Jack, but no less dangerous. "This ends tonight." Ruby's fingers tightened around the grip of her revolver. She had faced worse odds before, but there was something about these men that felt different. They weren't just hired guns, they were personal. Jack had something to answer for, and these men were here to collect. Jack didn't flinch. His eyes were cold, calculating, completely devoid of fear. Ruby had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Not tonight," Jack said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. His gun was aimed at the man's chest, the other hand resting calmly at his side. "And not ever." The man with the sneer raised his own weapon, but Ruby was faster. In one smooth motion, her gun was out and aimed, a flash of metal in the dim alley. She didn't hesitate. A shot rang out, the bullet striking the ground inches from the man's foot, sending a clear message. She wasn't here to play. "Don't make us do this," Ruby said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. She wasn't used to speaking like this. Like a threat was a second language, but these men didn't deserve anything else. Jack's gaze never left the leader, the man who had spoken first. His jaw tightened as he took a step forward, not towards the man but towards the group, his stance unyielding. "You want me? You're going to have to go through her," Jack said, his voice cold, challenging. "And I wouldn't recommend it." The leader's eyes flickered to Ruby briefly, assessing her. There was a brief moment of hesitation, as if he was weighing his options, but the men behind him didn't hesitate. They drew their guns, the sharp click of metal echoing through the alley. Ruby's heart raced, but she wasn't scared. She was prepared. The first shot came from the leader, from the E, a fast, reckless move. Ruby ducked, but she knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking control of the situation, keeping Jack alive, keeping herself alive, and getting through this without the men thinking they'd won. Jack was already moving faster than Ruby had anticipated. His shot was precise. One bullet, one man down. The second man went down almost as quickly. Ruby had only a second to react before the third came at her with a wild swing, trying to take her gun. She sidestepped, throwing her shoulder into him, using his own momentum to send him sprawling to the ground. By the time the last man took aim, it was too late. Jack's hand shot out, his revolver aimed with deadly precision. Another man down. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sounds were the distant howls of the wind and the soft, shallow breaths of the two survivors, Ruby and Jack. Ruby looked down at the men sprawled in front of her, their blood soaking into the dirt. It wasn't the first time she had seen death, but this felt different. These men had come for Jack, and they had tried to drag her into their madness. Now, they were nothing but bodies in the alley. Jack holstered his revolver, his eyes scanning the wreckage, his face still hard as stone. He didn't look at Ruby right away, but she saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his shoulders stiffened. He wasn't satisfied with what had just happened. No, Jack Dalton wasn't the type to celebrate a fight, even one he had won. Ruby stood still, her hand still gripping her weapon, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. It was over for now, but there was no escaping what it meant. Jack's past would never truly let him go, and neither would hers. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," Jack said after a long silence, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no anger in it, only the heavy weight of regret. Ruby shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the bodies in front of her. "You think I could have stayed out of this?" she asked. "You're not the only one with a past, Jack. I've been running from mine for a long time." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the ground for a moment, his hand resting on the handle of his gun, his body tense. He was thinking about something, perhaps about how much he had already sacrificed, how much he had lost. "We don't have time for regrets," Ruby continued, her voice firm, no longer allowing herself to be swayed by the darkness that hung between them. "We need to keep moving, more of them will come." Jack's eyes flicked to hers, a flicker of something unreadable in them. Maybe it was admiration, or maybe it was recognition, but there was no denying it. Ruby McAllister was no stranger to the life Jack had led. She had her own ghosts to deal with, and now it seemed they were both running from them. Jack took a step forward, the sound of his boots heavy against the dirt. "You're right," he said, his voice low but steady. "Let's get out of here." Ruby nodded, her hand still tightly gripping her revolver, but her eyes were on the path ahead. The storm hadn't passed yet. It was only just beginning. The night was still heavy with tension as Jack and Ruby made their way through the back alleys of the town, avoiding the main roads and sticking to the shadows. Ruby's senses were on high alert, her eyes scanning every corner, every movement in the darkness. They hadn't made much noise after the fight. There was no time to waste on celebration or mourning. Jack didn't look back at the bodies they had left behind. He didn't have to. Ruby knew what it cost him to pull that trigger, to end those men's lives even if they had come for him. They kept moving, their footsteps quick but quiet, as though they were both aware that there were more waiting for them, more men who had heard the shots, more enemies who would come looking for answers. Ruby didn't know how long they would be able to stay ahead, but she knew one thing. Jack's past wasn't going to stay buried forever. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of town, where the land opened up into wide, empty stretches of dirt and scrub. It was the kind of place where no one would ask questions, but where there were few places to hide. The open landscape felt like a prison to Ruby. She preferred the trees, the cover, the safety of the woods. Jack stopped walking and turned to face her, his face unreadable as always, but there was something different in his eyes now. The events of the night had clearly shaken him. Though he wasn't showing it, he never did. "We need to get moving before more of them show up," he said, his voice low but with a quiet authority. Ruby nodded, but she wasn't ready to move on just yet. She needed answers. She had to know more about what she was getting herself into, and more importantly, she needed to understand Jack, why he couldn't let go of his past and why he was dragging her into it. "You've been running, haven't you?" Ruby said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. Jack's gaze hardened slightly, but he didn't look away. He knew what she was asking. "It's not something I can just run from," Jack replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "The past has a way of following you no matter how far you go. I thought I could outrun it. I was wrong." Ruby felt a twist in her chest. She had been running too, in her own way. Her past wasn't as dark as Jack's, but it was a weight she carried with her every day. She could understand what he meant. Sometimes the only way to survive was to keep moving, to keep running until there was nowhere left to run to. "You're not the only one who's been running," Ruby said softly, her eyes meeting Jack's. There was a vulnerability in her words, a quiet truth she rarely shared with anyone. "I've spent my whole life trying to outrun things that aren't even chasing me anymore, but I never could stop. Not until now." Jack looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind, "for pulling you into this. You didn't ask for any of this." Ruby shook her head. "We don't get to choose our paths, Jack. They're laid out for us whether we like it or not." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They both knew the weight of the choices they had made, the paths they had walked. The fight was far from over, but for the first time Ruby wasn't sure she wanted to walk it alone. "We need to keep moving," Jack said after a long pause, his voice once again steady and firm. "There's a place I know, far from here. It's safe for now. We can lay low until this blows over." Ruby wasn't sure what to say. She wanted to argue, to ask why she should trust him, why she should follow him to another place that would inevitably lead to more trouble. But deep down, she knew she didn't have much of a choice. There was nowhere else to go, and maybe, just maybe, this was the only place she could go. Jack turned, leading the way into the night, eating. Ruby followed, but she didn't stop thinking about the choices they had made, and the ones still to come. There was no going back. They were both running, yes, but they were running together now, and that had to mean something. The night stretched on, the cool desert air biting at their skin as they moved deeper into the wilderness. Jack's pace was steady, never rushing but never slowing either. Ruby followed, her boots crunching softly against the dry earth, her mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. The fight in the saloon had been inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. She had seen men die before, but this felt different. This felt personal. She glanced at Jack as they walked, the silhouette of his figure cutting through the dim moonlight. He was a man with a past that had followed him here, to this small town, and now into the open desert. She could feel it in his every movement, the weight of everything he had done and the things he regretted. But what was it about him that made her stay? Was it the danger? Or was it the fact that despite all the darkness, he felt like someone she could understand? Ruby's thoughts were interrupted as Jack slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the horizon. He stopped and motioned for her to do the same. They crouched low behind a boulder, the dark landscape stretching out before them like an endless ocean of sand and rock. "There's a camp up ahead," Jack said in a low voice. "We'll stay here until morning." Ruby nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. She could see the faint outline of a campfire flickering in the distance, the shadows of men gathered around it. The figures were too far to make out clearly, but she knew that it wasn't just a peaceful gathering. They were too close to town, and they looked too rough to be innocuous. "Who are they?" Ruby asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Not sure," Jack replied. "Could be a band of outlaws or just some drifters. But we can't take any chances. We wait until they settle down and then we make our move." Ruby didn't question Jack's orders. She trusted him more than she cared to admit, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she had no other choice. Maybe it was because deep down she knew he wasn't the kind of man who would abandon her. He wasn't the kind of man who could afford to have anyone close to him. But Ruby had never been good at letting go, and she wasn't sure if she could walk away from him now, even if she wanted to. They waited in silence, crouched low behind the boulder, the firelight casting long shadows across the desert floor. The sound of the wind whistling through the canyons was the only noise that broke the stillness. After what felt like hours, the men around the fire began to settle down, their voices lowering as they drifted off to sleep. Jack gave Ruby a quiet nod, signaling that it was time to move. They crept forward, careful to avoid making any noise as they approached the camp. Jack's eyes were sharp, scanning the area for any signs of movement. Ruby followed his lead, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't afraid, but she wasn't comfortable either. The uncertainty of what was ahead gnawed at her. This life, this constant running, was beginning to take its toll. When they reached the edge of the camp, Jack motioned for Ruby to stop. He crouched down, peering through the shadows at the group of men gathered around the fire. Ruby stayed low, her breath steady, as she waited for Jack's signal. One of the men moved, standing up from the fire, and Jack took that as his cue. In one swift motion, he rose from his crouch and moved toward the nearest horse, his hand already gripping the reins. Ruby followed, staying low and keeping her gun close. They didn't speak. There was no need to. The tension between them was enough. Jack mounted the horse, pulling Ruby up behind him. The horse was strong, its muscles rippling under their combined weight as they rode swiftly away from the camp. the sound of their hooves pounding against the hard earth. The desert seemed to stretch on forever, the landscape dark and unforgiving. Ruby held onto Jack, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this exposed, this vulnerable, but she didn't pull away. She didn't want to. Not yet. They rode in silence, the firelight of the camp growing smaller and smaller behind them, until it was nothing more than a flicker on the horizon. Ruby's thoughts wandered back to the confrontation in the saloon, to the man who had come for Jack and failed. It wasn't over. Nothing ever was with Jack. As they rode deeper into the desert, the weight of the silence between them grew heavier. Ruby's mind raced. What was next? What was Jack's plan? And more importantly, what was hers? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack spoke. "We'll reach a town in a couple of days," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "You can go your way then. You don't have to stay with me." Ruby wanted to laugh, but there was no humor in it. She wasn't sure what to say. She had spent her whole life alone, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about something else, something more complicated than she could put into words. "I'm not going anywhere," Ruby said, her voice firm. Jack didn't respond right away, but his grip on the reins tightened, just enough for Ruby to feel it. There was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding that neither of them wanted to voice out loud. Ruby pressed her cheek against his back, the rhythmic movement of the horse lulling her into a strange, peaceful quiet. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if Jack's past would catch up with them, or if they would be able to escape the ghosts of the past once and for all. But for now, they were together, and that was enough. The days that followed were quiet, eerily so. Ruby and Jack rode in silence, the landscape around them stretching on in a vast, endless sea of dust and rock. The weight of the journey settled into Ruby's bones, her muscles sore from the long hours spent on horseback. The heat during the day was unbearable, and the nights grew cold as the desert air shifted. The land was unforgiving, and so were the memories that seemed to haunt both of them. Ruby kept her eyes forward, watching the dust kick up behind them, her mind a swirl of thoughts she couldn't quite organize. She had never imagined herself in a situation like this, riding through the desert with a man she barely knew, running from the past, unsure of what awaited her at the end of the road. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know where Jack was going. But she knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back. She glanced over at Jack, his silhouette stark against the harsh sunlight. He was still focused, never letting his guard down. His eyes were always scanning the horizon, always looking over his shoulder. Ruby had seen the signs. He wasn't just running from the men who had followed them. He was running from something much bigger, something that had shaped him into the man he was. They had reached a small dusty town by the end of the third day, as Jack had promised. The settlement was a far cry from the small frontier towns Ruby was used to. No saloon to speak of, no bustling markets. It was a place for drifters, for people who had nowhere else to go. And that's exactly what they were, drifters with nowhere to turn. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in a deep shade of red and orange as they entered the town. Ruby could feel the eyes of the few people still on the streets, their gazes heavy and curious. This was a town that didn't welcome outsiders, but Jack didn't seem bothered. He had been to places like this before. He knew how to survive. They dismounted in front of the only building that looked remotely like an inn, its sign hanging crooked above the door. Jack led the horse to a nearby post, tying it up with quick, practiced movements. Ruby followed, her boots hitting the hard ground with a dull thud. "I'll get us a room," Jack said, his voice low. His eyes flicked to the building's door, then back to Ruby. "You stay close." Ruby nodded, though she didn't need him to tell her that. She wasn't about to wander off, not in a place like this. The tension in the air was thick, and she could feel the unease of the town pressing in on her. She stayed close to Jack as he walked into the building, his steps firm and steady. Inside, the air was stale, the room dimly lit by a few weak lanterns hanging from the ceiling. A tired-looking man stood behind a counter, watching them with tired eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded at Jack as he approached. "We'll need a room for the night," Jack said, his voice even. The man didn't hesitate, taking Jack's coins without a word. "First door on the left," he muttered, his gaze flicking to Ruby briefly before returning to the counter. Jack turned toward Ruby, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Stay in the room. Don't go out until I say so." Ruby didn't argue. She didn't need to. Jack was right to be cautious, and she could feel the danger that lingered in the air. She followed him up the narrow staircase, her hand resting on the wooden banister, the boards creaking underfoot. When they reached the door, Jack opened it and stepped inside, holding it open for Ruby to follow. The room was small, sparsely furnished, 2 worn beds, a table, and a dusty window looking out over the town. Jack shut the door behind them, the sound of the lock clicking into place sending a small chill down Ruby's spine. Jack's gaze flicked to the window, and Ruby could see the storm brewing in his eyes. The past had followed them here, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to face it. Ruby sat down on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She knew Jack was hiding something. She could feel it, the way he avoided certain questions, the way he closed off whenever she got too close. She didn't expect him to share everything with her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the moment they'd just survived, the fight in the desert, the men who had come for Jack, was just the beginning. Jack walked over to the window, his hand resting on the sill. "We'll be here for a couple of days," he said, his voice almost distant. "Long enough to rest and regroup. After that, we move on." Ruby didn't ask where they were going. She wasn't sure she wanted to know, but she did ask one thing. "You ever going to tell me who those men were?" she asked softly. Her eyes meeting his. Jack didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his face was set, his eyes dark with a mixture of regret and determination. He didn't answer right away, but Ruby could see the weight in his gaze. It was the same weight he carried every day, the weight of the choices he had made, the ghosts he couldn't outrun. "You don't need to know," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm just trying to keep you safe, Ruby. That's all." Ruby stood up slowly, her heart heavy with something she didn't quite understand. She wasn't sure what Jack was running from or what he was hiding, but she wasn't going to let him carry this burden alone. Not anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady, even as it trembled inside. "I'm here with you, for whatever comes next." Jack's expression softened, but just for a moment. The brief flicker of something close to gratitude, was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Then you'd better stay sharp," Jack said, his voice low, his gaze returning to the window. "It's far from over." Ruby nodded, though the uncertainty still gnawed at her. What was coming next? She wasn't sure, but whatever it was, she wasn't walking away. Not now, not with him. The next morning came too quickly. Ruby's eyes fluttered open to the faint light creeping through the small dusty window. The night had been restless, her dreams filled with fragmented images of the men they had left behind, the ones Jack had crossed. The weight of her own thoughts had kept her up more than once. But when dawn broke, the world outside still felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, her body aching from the constant strain of the journey. Jack hadn't slept much, she knew. He never did. When she glanced over at him, he was already up, his back to her as he cleaned his revolver with methodical precision. His eyes were focused, his face as unreadable as ever, but Ruby could see the fatigue beneath it all. He was worn down, every part of him weighed down by his past, by the ghosts that refused to let him go. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. They both knew what the morning would bring. The town was quiet now, the early hours offering a brief respite from the chaos that had followed them here, but it wouldn't last. Jack holstered his gun and turned to face her. His eyes softened for a moment before the mask slipped back into place. "We leave in an hour," he said, his voice steady, but Ruby could hear the strain in it. Ruby nodded, brushing the dirt from her clothes. She had learned to adapt to this life, constant movement, constant danger, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her chest. Something was different now. She wasn't just running for herself anymore. As they packed up their meager belongings, Ruby's mind kept returning to the same thought. How long could they keep running? Jack had spent his entire life evading his past, but she knew there were limits. Sooner or later, the past would catch up with them. It always did. Once they had their gear together, Jack opened the door and stepped out first, his gaze scanning the street before motioning for Ruby to follow. She did, her heart quickening as they walked through the town. The early morning sun cast long shadows, and the streets were empty, the buildings standing like silent sentinels. Ruby could feel the weight of every eye on them as they passed by. She knew they were strangers here, and strangers weren't always welcomed in a town like this. They reached the edge of town without incident, but just as they were about to mount their horses, Ruby heard the sound of footsteps behind them. She turned, her hand automatically reaching for her revolver, but Jack was already on alert, his posture stiffening. A voice called out from the shadows. "Dalton," it said, low and threatening. Ruby's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. She knew the man standing in the alley, his figure barely visible in the morning light. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and his face was familiar, too familiar. "Davis," Jack said, his voice colder than Ruby had ever heard it. Davis stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dirt. There was a smugness in his expression, as if he had all the time in the world. His eyes locked onto Jack, and Ruby could see the history between them, the bad kind. "I thought you could just disappear, huh?" Davis sneered, his hand resting casually on the handle of a gun. "Thought you could run and hide, but there's no running from me." Ruby could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just some random encounter. This was personal. Jack's past had found him, and now it was coming for him in full force. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Ruby. His eyes stayed locked on Davis, and the anger in them was palpable. "I'm not running anymore, Davis," Jack said, his voice low, "but I'm not here for you." Davis took a step closer, his grin widening. "I think you are. You've been running for years, Dalton. It's time to pay the price." Ruby could feel the shift in the air, the unmistakable tension that preceded violence. She wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but she wasn't going to let Jack face it alone. She took a step forward, positioning herself slightly in front of him, her gun held at her side. "You've got a lot of nerve," Ruby said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "Coming after him like this. You're outnumbered." Davis didn't seem to care. His eyes flicked to Ruby for a split second before returning to Jack. "You think she's going to save you, Dalton?" Davis laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She's just another pawn in your little game." Ruby's grip on her revolver tightened. "You don't know anything about me, Davis." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, gently urging her back. "Stay out of this, Ruby," he said quietly, his voice a little softer than usual. "This is my fight." Ruby met his gaze, and for a brief moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. Guilt. A flash of something in his eyes that told her this wasn't just about survival for him. This was about redemption, and maybe, just maybe, it was about facing the ghosts of his past. But before Ruby could say anything else, Davis moved. It was swift, too swift. Ruby had barely drawn her gun when Davis's hand shot to his own holster, and the sound of a gunshot cracked through the air. Everything seemed to happen at once. Jack reacted instinctively, his gun drawn in the blink of an eye. But Ruby was faster. She fired. Davis collapsed to the ground, the shock in his eyes unmistakable. Jack stood still, his face unreadable as he stared at the man on the dirt. Davis didn't move again. Ruby's breath was shallow as she looked at Jack. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel his tension, his inner battle. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jack holstered his gun, his eyes finally meeting Ruby's. "Let's go," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "It's over." Ruby didn't argue. She didn't need to. They mounted their horses, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. The town was behind them now, and the road ahead was uncertain. But Ruby knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened, she wasn't going to let him face it alone. They rode into the horizon, the ghosts of the past still lingering in the distance, but for now, at least, they were together.
When the smoke clears and the bodies fall, only silence remains. If this story touched you, subscribe, because in the West, nothing stays buried for long.